good morning. This is my first time at Creative Mornings, and I'm coming in strong as a speaker. But I've been really impressed this morning just seeing folks arrive and like people know each other and just to learn about like the history. And I'm honored to be invited to talk to you this morning. So I'm going to talk, the title of my talk, Bawl or Nothing, Tears, Power, and Resistance on Screen. And as you might have just seen, because it got ahead of me, this is kind of the overview. I'm going to take you on a journey through my evolving relationship with tears and emotion in my films. From secret tears to transformative crying, I've discovered how these moments reshape not only my characters, but also my understanding of storytelling itself. So I'm going to start talking about how I got here. I have a unique journey to filmmaking that I want to share because I think it speaks to the circuitous paths many of us take as artists. I started with a degree in geography with a minor in Latin American studies from the University of Texas at Austin, so I'm from Texas. And then I moved to Portland to become a parking lot attendant. I've also been an apprentice union carpenter. I was in the Peace Corps in Panama for 2.5 years. And then I became a training manager for a nonprofit that helps women prepare for careers in construction. There I taught everything from job culture, like how to swing a hammer, how to read a measuring tape. But I also talked about this leap of faith that students would eventually have to take in order to leave their current job and follow their dreams. And that was a big part of that class, was like working up to that, and it was hard for some people. But I loved that job, and I did it for 9 years. And one day, I realized that while I was encouraging these women to pursue their dreams, I was neglecting my own. I had been filming and making things as a hobby. I'd done like some small doc projects and started making videos at work, and I started getting more work. And I also had this unique skill set of someone that knew their way around a construction job site, and then also now knew how to make video. And so the construction industry started hiring me to go out on job sites and film. I did a report to Congress on apprenticeship for the Bureau of Labor and Industries. And this was all kind of like on the side while I was working at the nonprofit. And I really enjoyed it. And I just wondered like what it would be like to pursue that for a living and also get me closer to this goal of maybe making films. So I took the leap of faith and I quit and started my own production company called Hearts and Sparks. And at that, it was a rough start at first. I began by taking any job that I could get, lots of volunteer stuff, events, projects for friends. It was really hard at first, especially all the business stuff. Like I'd never been a business person and having to learn about, taxes, and I kind of glaze over thinking about all that stuff. So I had a lot of learning to do. But eventually I also learned how to earn a living at doing this. And the most important thing about that in terms of my film career was that because I was self-employed, I had freedom over my schedule so that I could actually start to make films. And so I started making shorts, I kept making shorts, and then that leads up to 2021. I made my first feature film, Mother of Color, now streaming in 25 countries. We'll talk more about that later. But I still have my company. I work as a freelance director. I work as a filmmaker. And then I'm also a creative director part-time at Funnelbox, which is a B Corp video and animation production company here in town. I wanted to point all of this out because I did not go to film school. And I'm entirely self-taught, but I just want to say that there's no one way to get where you want to go. Okay, so we're here to talk about tears. So before all of that stuff, I was just a kid struggling with too many feels. I've always been able to access emotion easily. As a child, I was labeled too sensitive. And I remember watching movies and always being like the first one or maybe even the only one to cry. And I would have to like hide it or like turn my head and like find ways of pretending like it wasn't happening. It always felt like my body was betraying me. And I would try to like push it down. That doesn't actually work, but I would try. And at one point I saw the movie Broadcast News. And does anyone know what I'm going to talk about? Yeah, I see some nods. Okay. So There's a scene where Holly Hunter's character, it's in like the opening scenes, she gets off the phone and she sits on her bed and she unplugs the landline and makes herself cry, and she just sits there and cries. And it just made an impression on me because I'd never seen anyone, actually embrace their tears, let alone make themselves do it. And I'm sure I went on to continue hiding my tears in public, but this seed had been planted that maybe there was a value to crying. So I'm going to talk about crying today, but I also want you to know that I have a full emotional range. I get angry too. I love to laugh. I learn to embrace every part of the spectrum. I think most people would actually describe me as rather even keel. But over time, I have learned to accept this sensitivity as an important part of who I am. So I try to embrace tears. It's just like a natural response that allows me to connect with my most authentic self. I think I always want to say, like, if super tasters is a thing, I want to be known as a super feeler. Okay, so we're going to talk about types of tears. So there's empathetic crying, when witnessing another person's suffering or experiencing compassion. There's joy or relief crying, triggered by overwhelming positive emotions like achieving a goal, a big life event, or seeing intense beauty. There's anger or frustration crying, when people feel anger and helplessness, or the helplessness or in a situation they can't control. There's fear or anxiety crying, when someone feels threatened or insecure. There's sadness or grief crying, triggered by loss, disappointment, or sorrow. And this is the main type of crying that we're going to be talking about today. It's also the most common type of crying. Can I just take a quick poll? How many criers are in the audience? Is this what happens when you hang out with artists? Okay, so I'm glad to be in good company. So what I love about emojis, by the way, is just that it's this socially acceptable way to express tears in society. Of course, they're very tiny on the screen, but I'll take it. And then also, I love ugly crying too, and the way people use that phrase so willingly. It's more about the intensity, it's not necessarily about the source, but that's, bawling and letting it all out, like uninhibited. All of these forms of crying offer emotional regulation and social signaling, but they also, like some of them especially, offer self-soothing, like sadness crying does. Yet, we are taught to reject crying, to apologize for it. It's too much vulnerability. I'm not crying, you're crying. Crying is often seen as unprofessional or weak. And the emotional labor required to suppress our emotions isn't just about controlling tears. It's also about this monitoring and adjusting of all of our inner feelings, just in order to meet societal expectations. It can be incredibly exhausting on top of whatever was making you cry to begin with. So it's a lot to have to manage. But crying is powerful. It can help us purge emotional pain. And it can also be a form of resistance. It's like saying, I'm not okay with this, even when words fail. Allowing ourselves to cry can be a reclamation of personal power and a refusal to conform to these expectations. And it can also be transformative, prompting us to look within, figure out what truly matters, and take action. And that is the case for how crying appears in my first short film, which is called Sister and the Brotherhood. It was made in 2015. I directed it. My friend Dr. Roberta Hunt produced it. And it stars the incredible Sidonie O'Neill. It's about an apprentice carpenter facing discrimination on the job. And there's this scene where the main character gets yelled at for a mistake that she didn't actually make. And she runs to the only place that she can go to express herself, the porta potty. And because I don't want to keep saying that word, I'm going to call it the porta-john, which is this. And Kaylin wanted me to make sure people knew what a porta-john was. It's a refuge where she can cry without judgment and reclaim her emotional autonomy. She has a moment to herself where something happens, and avoiding spoiling it. And when she emerges, she knows exactly what she has to do. It's like Superman stepping into a phone booth to transform himself, except the transformation is brought on by tears, and it's a porta-john. The film screened all around the world, and tradeswomen in particular talked about how real that moment in the porta-john was. It resonated because they had never seen themselves represented on screen like that, and it also captured a truth that having a good cry in the bathroom is the only thing you can do sometimes. When I worked as a carpenter, I too found myself crying in the bathroom, whether it was just like some jerk that didn't want me there or a really bad day. I would run in there and do what I needed to do. But in the movie version, she comes out and she does something heroic. She boldly defies her boss as a way of standing up for herself. This was not the first time that I put crying on the screen, but it was my first short that I got to experience with a lot of audiences and a lot of different locations. And I saw how the movie and this display of emotion in particular affected people, and it really just made me realize how powerful cinema can be in a new way. So I'm going to take a second to talk about reflection, because that's why we're here. So about a year ago, my film was, finally out in the world, and I was ready for something new. I was trying to figure out, what would happen after being part of this huge project. What might I want to do next? And I've always thought of filmmaking as a chance to invite people into my gaze. So that means, what did I have to say about the world that might be helpful or add to the conversation? What were my intentions now? I did some journaling, and I also rewatched all of my films. And I realized that every single one of them has a moment where a character breaks down and cries. And this was not intentional. And then I remembered a moment back, I don't know, it'd been like a few years later, where my friend Briar Levitt commented. I put this Super 8 film that I'd made like a long time ago at Northwest Film Center. And it had these, it was kind of talking about being overwhelmed by all the bad things that happen, and when do you cry and when do you not cry, and I had these like close-up shots of her crying. And Briar saw that, and she said, "You've been talking about this for a while." And at that time, I was taken aback because I didn't see that pattern. I hadn't put that together. And I'm sure I just forgot about that conversation and then went on to put these types of scenes in even more films. And I've obviously had this ongoing subconscious exploration about these emotional releases. I can't seem to help but put them in my stories. So discovering this recurring motif made me reflect on my own relationship with vulnerability. Why did I keep coming back to these moments? And I don't think it was about catharsis. I think it was about acknowledging and honoring this part of myself that needed to be seen. Making these films allowed me to express these emotions publicly, not directly, but through the characters and stories that I was creating. So I understand when they say that filmmakers often spend their whole lives making the same movie over and over again. But it was only through reflection that I was able to fully see the evolution of my thinking and how that plays out on screen. So, Mother of Color, in 2021, I directed the feature, and this was 6 years and 4 films after Sister and the Brotherhood. The story follows Noelia, brilliantly portrayed by Ana del Rocio, a single mother struggling to keep it all together. And she's so overwhelmed by the demands of her life that she's disconnected from her own emotions and inner life. She doesn't have time for emotions. But in her darkest moment, she's guided by her ancestors who help her reconnect with her inner self by allowing her to stop and feel what she's been holding back. It's a compelling emotional turning point where she reclaims her sense of self and power. In Sister and the Brotherhood, the emotional release, the crying and the porta-john, helps her get her thoughts together to regroup, and then she goes back out. But in Mother of Color, the emotional release itself is a gift that she receives from her ancestors that allows her to start to heal and move forward. It gives her clarity. So for the first time, I had made emotions part of the plot line. And I've come to think of these crying scenes as moments of a kind of self-spirituality that actually give these characters a chance to process and heal. So this leads to a broader theme that's central to my work, which is the reclaiming of tears and vulnerability. So empathy, vulnerability, and sensitivity are often associated with the feminine and are dismissed as weaknesses in our patriarchal society. These traits aren't limited to women. They're an essential part of our humanity, a part of the full human experience. But when it comes to film, depictions of women on screen are still evolving, in part because of who has traditionally been in the director's chair. Many films choose not to show deep expressions of emotion, but some directors and critics claim that restraint creates more tension, or they dismiss it as melodrama or manipulation. Even the concept of strong female lead fell in line. The idea was a necessary reaction to break this long pattern of shallow female characters. But strong female lead meant that women were depicted as strong only when they adopted traditionally masculine traits like stoicism or physical strength. But what if we redefine strength? What if vulnerability was seen as power? What if tears were a form of strength? It's ironic because it takes courage and strength to show your vulnerability. In my films, I strive to show powerful characters who are resilient and strong, and they are vulnerable, empathetic, and emotionally expressive. And every time I say vulnerability, I think of Brené Brown because she's become famous for talking about the value of vulnerability, and she brings science and data to the conversation, which is important. But also, these ideas have been championed for a long time in the writings of women like Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and Gloria Anzaldúa, each of whom, in their own way, pushed back against the idea that emotional suppression and stoicism equal strength. Gloria Anzaldúa in particular talks about how this way of thinking harms everyone by forcing people to sever themselves from their emotional and spiritual selves. But you should check out, all three of them talk about this in different ways. But as a filmmaker, I'm passionate about exploring these ideas in my stories and also in how we experience them in cinema itself. Creating emotional spaces. So I see theaters as safe emotional spaces where we can come together to feel and connect, creating a shared experience that deepens our understanding of ourselves and each other. To create a space like this during production, I'll often use dim or low-key lighting, close-up shots, and have the actor actually directly facing the audience or the camera. And I think that this can make for a more powerful connection sometimes. And when a performance like this is projected 10 or 20 foot tall on a screen, it can be, profoundly moving. It's an exaggerated representation that brings these emotions to life in a way that's impossible to ignore. But to be clear, people cry in movies all the time. Things happen on screen constantly. There was a period in the 70s and 80s when the weepy genre thrived. These were often tragic films known for their emotional depth and intensity. They explored themes of love, loss, family, and resilience. People went to these movies knowing they were going to cry. And every single one of these was nominated for some sort of Oscar. Perhaps we don't see tearjerkers in theaters as much today because there's already so much sadness around us. And we seem to prefer to watch it alone with our phones and screens. But that's precisely why we need these shared spaces where we can sit together in a dark theater and experience that collective catharsis, to process our emotions and preserve humanity together. Whether it's about the story we're watching or something else that the movie touches within us. It's a space where you have permission to feel and be vulnerable. So I'm going to take a little turn here and talk about, what is this? Lord of the Rings. Okay. So could somebody give me some more water? I'm okay. Thank you so much. So I happened to be in New York City in December of 2001. I was visiting my brother, and that was when Lord of the Rings came out. And I went to go see it, so this was a few months after 9/11. And I sat in the theater and watched the movie, and a bunch of Lord of the Rings things happened. And then that spot late in the film when all is lost, the guru has a conversation. In this case, it's Gandalf and Frodo. And Frodo says, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." And Gandalf says, "So do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with that time that is given to us." And it was this sage piece of advice, and he was talking about Lord of the Rings stuff, but it seemed as if for everyone in that theater, he was talking about 9/11. And people were just sobbing. And I just I think it's because they were in this dark theater. They had this space to like let their emotions out. You know, no one's looking at each other, everyone's looking up here. And I think it can just be incredibly healing. It makes me think about this Brian Eno quote about how art is a trigger for experience. When we respond emotionally to film, it's partly about the empathy for the character that you've come to know, but it is absolutely about yourself and what other experiences might be triggering from your own life. Thank you. And I have another story about this, which is from the night we premiered Mother of Color at the Hollywood Theater. So it was a really rainy night, and I remember walking in, you know, I got there early, and I was worried that no one was going to come, because it was just like pouring rain, like sheets, like in a way it doesn't usually pour. And one by one, people started coming. You know, we had our cast and our crew, we had our Kickstarter backers, we had family, friends, mothers. It was like, you know, all these people coming together. We packed it. It was full. It was 384 people in the space. And what made it special is that it wasn't just a regular audience. It really was this like connected community. There was a kind of shared energy because of that, I think. And you know, the lights dimmed and the film begins, and there was this sense of anticipation. No one knew exactly what to expect. Like, we'd been talking about it for a long time, but no one knew what it was going to be like. And then later comes this big scene. It's an emotional scene with the ancestor. And Anna's performance was so powerful. I could feel the entire room like holding its breath. And I saw people starting to cry, like caught up in the story and the emotion on screen. And even though I'd watched the scene like, you know, I don't know, hundreds of times is what it feels like when you're making a film, you know, through the editing process, through scoring, through color grading, through exporting, I found myself crying too. Yes, I cried for the character's journey. I cried for the sheer amount of work and passion it took to get to this moment. But mostly I cried because I was so moved to be there sharing this experience with everyone. And I think some of that was like pandemic related. This was 2022, and I know, the pandemic was winding down, but I just hadn't been in a room with that many people for so long, and it just, like something was happening, and I was just like very moved by that experience. But I just saw it as like a collective release, which is totally what I wanted to happen, but you know, you wasn't sure that it would, and I was surprised by all the other things that came up when I cried. So it made me want to be even more intentional about creating these types of spaces. So the latest evolution of my thinking is crying, now with more laughter. I don't necessarily want to watch tragic movies these days either. I don't want to make one. And after that period of reflection and thinking about where I wanted to go next with my film, I came up with something that I've never done before that also continues the ideas around emotion. It's called Appliance of Science, and it's a sci-fi dramedy about a cynical woman who undergoes an experimental treatment involving household appliances in order to reclaim her ability to feel. And emotions are absolutely part of the plot. One of its characters, well actually most of the characters are desperately trying to feel anything at all. And it takes inspiration from movies like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind or Everything Everywhere All at Once. And it uses absurdity and humor to examine what it's like to be alive right now when we're every day taking in these devastating things. You know, seemingly we're helpless to change or stop them. But the film asked, how can we stay emotionally vibrant in a world that often forces us to suppress what we might feel in order to go about our lives? The main character discovers the value of emotion as she navigates a breakup, attends quirky group therapy sessions with fellow emotional misfits, and doom watches the news every night. There's even a character who is working hard to experience the best emotion, which she describes as a powerful combination of empathy, awe, gratitude, and hope. I think of it as an odyssey through and celebration of this full spectrum of human emotion in all its messy and beautiful splendor. And it's funny, or so I hope. And yes, there will be some crying. It may take me some time to get it all put together and raise the money, but this is something that I want to make, and by just the way this lined up, there's a related short that was kind of like an early inspiration for this idea that's playing Tuesday at the Kennedy School. It's called Feelings Experiment. And it's inspired by, I was thinking about, you know those videos where you see someone hear for the first time, like they get their hearing aid or they see for the first time, and those always get me. And I was wondering what it would be like if someone were to feel for the first time. And so it kind of follows that through. And it's related to the feature script, but it's different. And it's done in a very low-budget DIY fashion. So you'll have to excuse me for that. I wanted to try it. I'm not sure that I'm going to do that again, but, but it's a fun movie. It's showing with a feature film called Sing to Me, Selvi. So I want to talk about creating new narratives with storytelling. I'm excited to enter into the realm of science fiction where you can talk about like alternate worlds. It's a quote from my favorite scholar. Nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our heads. As artists, we have the power to create new narratives that challenge societal norms and expand what's possible. By embracing the full spectrum of human emotions and experiences, we can tell stories that resonate deeply and inspire change. Whether it's a sci-fi dramedy about a woman getting her emotions back or a short film about a tradeswoman struggling to find her place, these stories matter because they offer new ways of seeing the world and each other. So I'm going to end on a 2-minute montage of crying from my films, but I have a few thoughts about reflection first. So reflection is essential in my work, and I think it's more than just like looking back. It's about how we interact with and reinterpret our own work. And audiences are also part of that. Meanings can change and evolve when we look closely. Through reflection, I've realized that each of my films is part of an ongoing dialogue with myself and my audience about what it means to feel deeply. This evolution from private moments of resistance to narratives centered around emotional healing has helped me understand my own voice as a filmmaker, and I hope offers audiences a way to stay connected to themselves too. The Supercut is a visual tour of my journey as a filmmaker and as a person continually learning to embrace and honor my own emotional expression. What role do emotions play in your life and work? How can we all move towards a world where vulnerability is celebrated and not shamed? Maybe you'll take a moment today to reflect on your own emotional journey and how you might embrace your tears. And if you do choose to embrace them, it's ball or nothing. Okay, so we're going to watch this and check the audio. Let's see how this goes. Yeah.
No.
She is affected by and compassionate for the sudden death of a man she has never met.
Oh, look at that face. Here, let me help. Hey, watch it!
The emotion's there. If I need it, I can get it.
Nosotros compartimos la misma herida.
That's it. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.